Is that one thing that got me tripping? Is that one thing that got me?
Huh? Okay, so in the last video, I went in depth about lighting fundamentals and why value is important in our illustrations. And in this video, I wanted to kind of apply those facts, those fundamentals, and give a prime example of how it would be used and where it's most effective. And also just show you guys a basic illustration process of how I would actually do it myself. Every painting style for every artist is going to be a little bit different. They're going to use different brushes, different textures, different techniques, and their approach and their perspective is going to be different. So this is mine. I'm not saying it's perfect, but it's what I like to do, and it's what works for me. It's my preferred style. So without further ado, let's get into it. Okay, so I thought I'd just do a full in-depth tutorial on how I actually illustrate. And so you're going to start by noticing that I am of course just starting off with a simple sketch. Just using the fundamental idea of shapes that we were talking about earlier, and how it is implemented into how we build a form. I don't necessarily have a full idea in mind. I'm just starting with a pose. By this point I didn't really know any sort of character or anything I wanted to draw. This is just completely freestyling it. I'm just rolling with the punches right now. I didn't have any thumbnails prepared or anything. I just wanted to see what would work and if I liked it. By this point, I started to get an idea for a concept of what I wanted to draw. I was outlining the character just to see the silhouette and see if I liked the composition. And I realized I wanted to draw a witch character. And so, implementing the idea of a witch hat. In later parts of the illustration, I'm going to implement a magic circle. And then I started to think about the perspective later on. This isn't something which you should generally do. It's usually better to think about the perspective before you start drawing the actual character. In this case, I think I did pretty well as to adding the background in. But normally you'd want to do the character and their perspective all at the same time, not separately. It just makes the entire process for the illustration easier. But as you can see here, I'm really just building on top of the sketch. I am not doing any sort of specific line art, and I'm not really focused on details too much. I'm just focused on getting the larger aspects of the image on the sketch that I have now. I'm not really using any sort of specific line weight, line art, maybe just cleaning things up here and there. But what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be using the lines that I have now. And I'm sorry if it looks a little sporadic. I do rotate and flip the canvas a lot while I'm illustrating. It's just easier on my wrist. And it also allows me to see things in a way that I want a little bit better. Especially when digitally illustrating, it really helps to learn your tools, the tools that you are going to be using. Each individual tool that you use is really going to help impact your workflow and speed things up. By this point, I start working on the background, and you're going to notice that I separate the foreground, the main character, and then the background. That way, it just makes separating the layers that much easier, and it's going to make doing the workflow for the illustration that much easier for me. I finally decided that I wanted to do a sort of cathedral theme, like a church with a porcelain pillar or something similar in the background. With light coming in. I wanted to have a couple light sources, but I also wanted to keep it sort of, I guess, fit with the theme of the character herself. By this point, I start separating the layers appropriately. I have the foreground, the background, the second background, which is going to be like the sky, clouds, and stuff, and then I have the main character illustration. For different artists are going to decide if they want to separate their layers for their main character illustration or not. For me, I find it just a little bit more satisfying to keep it all on one layer. I'm not thinking too hard about it, but it really just depends. This is when I start to get into the painting phase. You can tell that I start with a base color, and then I add in my highlights and then my darkest shadows, and then I start to blend from there. Sometimes you're going to realize that your values are off, or they aren't as dark in the darker areas that you want them to be, so it helps to use a value map or something similar. I'm sorry, not value map, tone curve. And as you can see, I'm selecting each areas individually, and then I'm working on them to a sort of completion, not entirely, but what I feel comfortable with. It helps to inverse your selection. That way you can work against conjoined areas without, bleeding into your painted area. You can tell that as I'm painting this, I'm really focusing on the fundamentals, which I discussed last time. Trying to have your base color, your light, your highlight, your core shadow, and then your refractive light. And I'm also using that idea to really focus a lot on the composition, how different areas are popping out. Like for the witch's hat, the backside of her hat is going to be a little bit lighter against her darker hair, which is going to sort of make her head pop just a little bit more, but it's also going to separate the hat from her head, or the hair. The importance of working with value is so that you could see that separation and you could see the difference in contrast. This is what's going to really provide a lot of perspective for your character. And also, I feel like working in grayscale like this, you aren't necessarily worried about if you're painting hues, if they're turning out muddy, because you can definitely always adjust those later in the illustration if you decide to paint over the grayscale. You aren't necessarily worried about the muddiness, more so you're worried about how you're texturing it, and I feel like there's a lot of free form that you can get out of texturing and grayscale just because your brain isn't working as hard. I definitely find it to be a relaxing process if you guys do decide to paint in grayscale yourselves. Around this point, I decided to start working with multiple light sources. I realized that if it is going to be a sort of cathedral type of thing, that I am also going to have light coming in from the front side of the character as well as the back side. This does give me a little bit more flexibility in how inaccurate I want to be with my lighting per se. I'm not really thinking about the lighting as hard as I need to be. It's going to make the illustration process itself a whole lot less strenuous on my thinking, and also it's just going to make it a little bit more relaxing. I'm going to be able to have a little bit more fun with where I'm highlighting and how I'm texturing, and really bringing out the life of the character, i.e. things like her clothing, her pants. Not necessarily need to worry about lighting entirely. I'm able to just make these areas that much more prominent. You can see now by the end of it, I've combined all the layers. Of course, like I said, separating the foreground, background, and character. layer. However, what I'm doing is I'm starting to paint over the line art and fill out those little details. Doing this is just to clean out the illustration. It's not for anything specific other than just making the illustration look in a way that I prefer. And when you're doing this kind of illustrations, it definitely helps to have reference. Like, I know as an artist, especially when you're drawing from imagination, it seems like you really have to be keen on focusing on your own thoughts, but that is not the case. In truth, it really helps to have reference and keep that reference handy. That way, as you're illustrating, you're understanding the textures that you want. And especially like for this illustration, I actually took a picture of boots, and what I did with that picture of boots is I grayscaled it. That way I could understand how the values work better. So not only are you able to put an item in grayscale, or paint and illustrate in grayscale to really separate those values and get an idea of how important value is to separating your composition. You can also take images of life drawings, illustrations, real life images, and put those into grayscale as well. And if you do that, then you're really going to see what separates things into a certain perspective, like how value is going to determine how close something is to you. Because like I described in the last video, the basic rule of value is as something gets further away from you, especially larger objects get further in the distance, we're talking like miles away, they're going to become lighter. And that's because of the humidity in the atmosphere and different factors involving how the light hits those hydrogen particles in the air. And it's a lot of scientific stuff, but it's also just good basic rules of thumb. So I did make the mistake of not saving the original part of the illustration, the one that I was just working on, as a grayscale image. So this is going to be the second half of the image, the image that I took a little more time to detail and paint. Disregarding that, I did want to just do a little in-depth study about what I have here. So, like stated before, for a fundamental of lighting, each element is going to have your core value, your light source, highlight, your core shadow, and then your refractive light. And we can see this used a lot here as we see this sort of progression between, highlight, core shadow, refractive light. This is going to be environmental lighting because this is supposed to be like a leather pair of pants, leather pair of shoes, meaning that this is refractive light. Not directly highlighted, but if we go to these areas, we do see this where we have highlight and then a core value with our core shadow right here, then refractive lighting coming, probably bouncing off from this platform right here. We do see this in various areas as well. You can always have backlighting as well. It really just depends on how you study it. For this character, I wanted to implement a sort of magic circle. And coming from behind that magic circle, it's going to be very bright because I want to implement a sense of power. And so what you could see is I'm going to have lit up areas behind the areas that are visible. And I want you to notice that in my strokes, I'm not being neat at all. This is something that I realized very long ago, is that a lot of the artists that we look up to are not as neat as we think. And we really tell ourselves that we have to be neat because, as we're growing up, like color inside the lines and stuff. But you don't need to be neat to have an effective art piece. Using your strokes effectively and making sure that you separate your values and how you construct your textures is going to be far more important than actually being neat. This is the difference between having like a muddy illustration and a creative illustration. And for the longest time, and I'm still getting over this, I had muddy paintings. And I'm finding now that the harsher you separate these things, this is why cell shading is so effective is because with cell shading, you aren't worried about blending textures. But with painting in a textured style like this, when you're blending these textures, if you don't blend them properly, then it can be very muddy. And so I'm really trying to be keen on separating your values aggressively. That is going to ruin a lot of, or remove a lot of the muddiness. I'm sorry. But like getting back into the main points, you can see I have my highlight areas over here. Nothing is too neat. Going back over, have refractive light coming off the bottom of the glasses. And it always helps to consider the materials that you're using, especially when you're doing values. If this is going to be a shiny leather boot, and these are going to be more of like a suede style pant, the shiny leather boot is going to have a lot more refractive lighting than the pant, because the pant is going to be a little bit more matte textured. It's going to be less reflective, whereas the boot is going to have a lot of reflection. The same with the glasses. That's why the glasses are as reflective, not nearly as reflective as something that is a little more matte, like the skin or the shirt, this bow right here. So it really helps to consider your textures. But again, consider how value separates the piece. If you look, you can see that the character is separated from the background very highly, because I'm giving her black pants, but I'm making the background this much lighter. Because we could tell by perspective using certain elements like the blurring right here, the blurring of the magic circle, and also having a foreground, we can tell that this character is in front of this area. This area just has lighting coming from this circle, and any lighting that is bouncing off this platform back onto this pillar right here, it is going to light up this pillar. However, doing this helps separate the character, and it makes this pillar actually look quite far away from the character. Maybe not that far away, but maybe a good like 5, 6, 7 feet behind her. That's what I feel the most important thing about value is the ability to separate things and really make the illustration or painting that much more readable. If you can have a good sense of value, then you can throw on colors at any point you want. Being able to paint with colors alone, that is a amazing thing to learn. Being able to learn how to use value and then adding on color afterwards is definitely going to help with your workflow, if workflow is what you're worried about. Painting in grayscale, painting in value, it's just one of those other things that you want to study. It's not something that you have to do, but it's something that you'll find a lot of professional artists will do. And they will do it because of the reason that it does help with workflow, and you're able to really separate your character from the background and the foreground that much more. With that being said, in the next video I am going to do an overview on how I would throw paint on this, and it's going to look something like this in the end. So if you have any questions or you want to learn about that, feel free to drop something in the comments below. Ask me questions about the grayscale painting process. If I didn't really touch on something, I was really just trying to review and show example of how I would do things. In the last video, I did talk more in depth on how grayscale works. So if it seemed like I was kind of rambling, I probably was. Just a little bit. But with that being said, I do hope you guys learned something from this. And again, if you have any questions, just ask me in the comments below. In the next video, I will be painting this. So, all in all, have a good one. Thanks for watching. Thanks for the support. And I really appreciate you guys.